Emily thought she knew her husband, Daniel Carter, until the night she found the hidden bank account, the falsified records, and the terrifying truth that her entire marriage had been built on his lies. Daniel and Emily Carter were the kind of couple people quietly envied. They had a beautiful brick home on Willow Lane, two cars in the driveway, and smiles that seemed effortless. Daniel was known as the dependable, kind man who never raised his voice and always offered to help neighbors fix a broken fence or carry groceries. Emily was the soft-spoken volunteer who ran the children's reading sessions at the Maplewood Library. To everyone around them, theirs was the kind of love story that made the world seem good and fair. But perfection, as it often turns out, was only a costume stitched together with secrets that it began with subtle changes. Emily started canceling her weekly library visits. She stopped meeting her close friend, Mary Ann, for coffee. When she did appear in public, her cheerful voice seemed forced, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her sunglasses or brushed her hair from her face. Neighbors noticed the curtains of the Carter house stayed drawn even on sunny days, and the lights flicked on late into the night. Daniel explained that Emily had been feeling unwell, headaches, stress, perhaps exhaustion. It was enough to quiet curiosity, at least for a while. Then one evening, a faint sound echoed down Willow Lane, an ambulance siren growing louder as it neared the Carter home. Flashing red lights splashed across driveways as paramedics rushed through the front door. Daniel stood outside barefoot, his shirt half-buttoned, shouting for help. Emily was found upstairs, unconscious, a nearly empty bottle of pills beside her. The neighbors gathered silently on the sidewalk, watching as she was carried out on a stretcher. Someone whispered that she'd tried to end her life. Someone else said they'd heard shouting earlier. No one really knew. But by morning, the news had spread across Maplewood. The woman everyone thought was living a peaceful, happy life had nearly died by her own hand. Detectives arrived soon after the paramedics left. It was routine in cases of self-harm, especially when the circumstances seemed unclear. They found a tidy home, everything in its place, nothing overturned or broken. The kitchen table held 2 wine glasses and a half-finished bottle, the scene of what looked like an ordinary evening. But there was something about the stillness of the house that didn't sit right with Detective Miles Turner. The framed photographs, perfectly aligned on the mantel, showed a couple who smiled just a little too wide. Their happiness looked posed. When Turner interviewed Daniel, he described his wife as loving but fragile. He said she'd been struggling with anxiety for months, plagued by guilt over things she wouldn't talk about. He mentioned that she often wrote in a journal and that she'd been distant recently, refusing to eat or sleep properly. He insisted there had been no argument, no fight. He'd simply gone to bed early and woke to find her collapsed on the bathroom floor. His story was calm, detailed, believable. But Turner had learned long ago that the most convincing lies often came wrapped in perfect details that the hospital. Emily lay unconscious for 2 days. Doctors weren't sure if she'd make it. When she finally opened her eyes, she said little. Her first words were quiet, trembling. She didn't want Daniel in the room. She asked for her phone, her bag, and then turned her face to the wall. Turner took note of that small act. It wasn't grief or confusion. It was fear. Back at the Carter house, detectives found no suicide note, no letters, nothing to suggest what had driven her to that point. But in the small desk in the study, beneath stacks of library receipts and greeting cards, Turner found a torn piece of paper tucked between the pages of a book. It had only one word written on it: sorry. The handwriting was shaky, almost desperate. He looked at it for a long time, then slipped it into an evidence bag. News of Emily's condition spread, and sympathy poured in. Neighbors left flowers by the gate. Daniel gave soft-spoken statements about mental health and resilience, about how love could heal even the deepest wounds. But Turner wasn't convinced. He'd seen too many homes like this, picture perfect on the outside, rotting on the inside. Something about the way Daniel spoke felt rehearsed, like a man reading from a script he'd memorized. When Emily finally stabilized, Turner requested to speak with her privately. She agreed, but only briefly. Her voice trembled when she said she'd made mistakes in her past, that she wasn't who people thought she was. When asked to explain, she shook her head and whispered, "It doesn't matter anymore." Then she looked away, eyes hollow, as if she'd seen something too painful to recall. Turner left the room, knowing only one thing for sure. Emily Carter was hiding something by the end of that week. The case that had started as a routine welfare check began to turn into something darker. Records didn't match, details about Emily's past seemed missing, and even Daniel's background had small inconsistencies. The police weren't ready to call it foul play, but they weren't ruling anything out either. What looked like a suicide attempt might just be the surface of something far more complicated, a story of lies, betrayal, and a past that refused to stay buried. Detective Miles Turner started digging into Emily Carter's past the morning after her hospital interview. Something about her tone, her hesitation, and that faint word "sorry" left him unsettled. He asked for her background records, employment history, and medical files, expecting a simple paper trail. Instead, he found gaps, missing years, inconsistent addresses, and an employment start date that didn't align with her supposed college graduation. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere 5 years ago. Her first known job was at the Maplewood Library, where she volunteered before being hired part-time. Before that, there was nothing. No tax records, no phone bills, no trace of her existence. Turner had seen identity changes before, but usually they followed trauma or crime. The question was, which one fit Emily Carter? The first break came from an unlikely place. When the detective checked her social security number, he found a second name attached to it, Emily Rhodes. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a previous legal identity. Turner called the police department in her former town, Brookhaven, a small city 2 hours away. There, he learned that an Emily Rhodes had been questioned 10 years earlier in connection with a financial fraud case involving a nonprofit charity. No charges were filed, but $50,000 had disappeared from the charity's account before she abruptly resigned and vanished. Turner read the case summary 3 times, trying to reconcile the image of the kind, mild woman lying in a hospital bed with the record of a possible embezzler. When he contacted the charity's director, an older woman named Helen Price, she confirmed that Emily had been a bright young woman who got caught up in something she didn't understand. Helen claimed Emily had panicked when the audit began and fled before the truth could come out. But Helen's version of the story ended with an odd statement. She wasn't the only one who should have been investigated. That single sentence opened a new door in Turner's mind. Meanwhile, Daniel remained publicly composed. He visited the hospital every day, bringing flowers and sitting silently beside Emily's bed. But to the nurses, it didn't feel like love. One of them quietly mentioned that Emily never looked at him when he entered the room. She kept her eyes closed until he left. Turner took note and began to wonder whether Daniel had known about his wife's past. When asked, Daniel acted surprised. He claimed he had no idea Emily was ever involved in a fraud case and insisted that she'd always been honest with him. His reaction seemed genuine, but something about it was too smooth, practiced. Even, Turner turned his focus back to Emily's former life. He discovered that after her disappearance, several attempts had been made to contact her, one of them only a week before her suicide attempt. It was from a woman named Laura Bennett, a former co-worker at the charity. When he finally reached Laura, she was hesitant but admitted she had recently tracked Emily down through social media. She said she only wanted closure, but her words suggested guilt. Turner pressed her for details, and Laura finally confessed that she had sent Emily a letter days before the overdose. She wouldn't reveal what she'd written, only that it was something Emily needed to hear. The timing was impossible to ignore. Turner filed a request to obtain the letter and searched Emily's home again. This time, he paid attention to the smallest details: the books on the shelf, the drawers that looked too neatly organized. In one of them, beneath folded receipts, he found an envelope torn in half, with part of a name still visible: Laura B. It was postmarked 3 days before Emily's collapse. Whatever that letter contained, it had shattered her fragile peace. The more Turner learned, the clearer it became that Emily's new life in Maplewood had been built on a foundation of fear. She had changed her name, started over, and married a man who either didn't know or pretended not to. Her journal, found in her bedside drawer, painted the picture of a woman constantly afraid of discovery. In one entry, she wrote that starting over isn't freedom. It's waiting for the truth to catch up. Another line, dated just a week before her suicide attempt, read, "He looks at me like he knows." The "he" remained a mystery. Turner assumed it referred to Daniel, but without Emily's confirmation, it was speculation. What disturbed him most was how deliberate her fears sounded, not of guilt, but of exposure. She wasn't afraid of what she'd done. She was afraid of what someone else might do if her past came to light. By the end of that week, Turner pieced together a rough timeline. 10 years ago, Emily Rhodes had worked at a charity where money vanished. She'd left suddenly, changed her identity, and reappeared as Emily Carter. For years, she lived quietly, married Daniel, and tried to blend in. Then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived, and days later, she tried to end her life. To Turner, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like someone had been waiting for the right moment to push her over the edge. And if that was true, then Emily Carter wasn't just a woman haunted by guilt. She might have been someone's target, and whoever that someone was, they were still out there, watching the story unfold. The torn envelope with Laura Bennett's name led Detective Miles Turner to an aging apartment complex 30 miles outside Maplewood. Laura answered the door cautiously, her eyes shifting between suspicion and regret. She confirmed she'd written to Emily, but claimed she never meant any harm. She said she'd recently stumbled upon Emily's new life through an old photo online, a smiling picture from the library's community event. Laura admitted she'd debated for weeks whether to reach out, finally sending a letter that said, "You can't hide forever. He deserves to know the truth." She thought Emily would contact her afterward, maybe to talk about closure. Instead, Emily was now in a hospital bed because of it. Turner pressed her on what truth the letter referred to. Laura hesitated, then said something that changed everything. She revealed that Emily wasn't responsible for the missing charity money. Back then, the audit team had included a young architect who volunteered part-time, helping with budgeting software. His name, Laura recalled clearly, was Daniel Carter. Turner's pen froze. The same Daniel who had later married Emily. According to Laura, the investigation 10 years ago had been chaotic. Records were incomplete, documents had gone missing, and blame had quickly shifted toward Emily, who handled donor correspondence. She'd been questioned, cried, and denied involvement, but with no evidence and no allies, she fled. A week later, the charity closed its case quietly. Laura always suspected someone else had diverted the funds, someone with access to the digital records. Daniel, she explained, had that access. He disappeared from the charity's records soon after the investigation ended. Turner left Laura's apartment with his mind racing. If her story was true, Daniel hadn't been the trusting husband Emily deceived. He'd been the deceiver all along. He pulled Daniel's employment records from that period and found something odd. The charity's records listed him as a consultant, but his address matched the same company that had processed the fraudulent transactions. Turner began to see the outline of a far darker story. A man who had used Emily to cover his tracks, then found her years later and ensnared her in a life she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Emily's recovery was slow. Her doctors reported she avoided visitors, including Daniel, who continued to visit daily and maintain his public image as a devoted husband. He gave sympathetic interviews to local reporters, saying his wife was suffering from deep emotional distress over her past mistakes. He positioned himself as the caring partner trying to help her heal. It played perfectly to the cameras, but Turner saw manipulation behind every word. With a warrant secured, Turner examined Daniel's financial records. Most of it appeared clean, but a small dormant account caught his attention, opened around the same time the charity funds vanished. Though untouched for nearly a decade, the deposit history matched the missing $50,000. It was the first solid link between Daniel Carter and the crime Emily had been blamed for. Still, something didn't add up. If Daniel had known Emily's real identity all along, why would he risk marrying her? Turner replayed Laura's statement in his mind. He deserves to know the truth. Maybe Emily had believed Daniel was innocent. Maybe she thought she deceived him by hiding her past. But what if the truth Laura meant wasn't about Emily's lie, but about Daniel's? The journal found in Emily's drawer added more clues. The last entries grew increasingly fragmented, filled with unease. She wrote about seeing patterns, about Daniel asking strange questions related to her time at the charity. One line in particular stood out. He says he forgives me, but I never told him what I did. Turner underlined it. It confirmed what he suspected. Emily never confessed her past to Daniel because she believed he didn't know it, which meant Daniel had been playing a role from the very beginning. When Turner confronted Daniel with questions about his connection to the charity, Daniel maintained his calm facade. He said he'd done minor volunteer work years ago and barely remembered Emily from that time. He claimed their marriage had been built on honesty and insisted he was as shocked as anyone to learn of her previous identity. Turner watched him closely. The measured tone, the slow blinking, the careful phrasing. It wasn't surprise, it was control. Daniel was managing the narrative, the same way he had 10 years earlier. Later that evening, Turner received a call from the Financial Crimes Unit. The dormant account under Daniel's name had a recent login, just 2 days before Emily's overdose. Someone had accessed it briefly and then tried to delete the online history. It was too specific to be coincidence. Turner realized that. Emily must have found something, perhaps a document, a receipt, or a password that revealed Daniel's involvement. That discovery, combined with Laura's letter, had pushed her over the edge. The next morning, Turner returned to the hospital to see Emily. She was sitting up, pale but alert, her eyes hollow yet watchful. When he mentioned the charity, she didn't speak. But when he said Daniel's name, her lip trembled. A tear slid down her cheek as she whispered a single sentence that confirmed everything. He knew before I did. That was enough for Turner. Emily might not have intended to expose her husband, but her words drew the line between guilt and survival. Daniel hadn't been blindsided by her secret. He had built their entire life around it. He'd married the woman he once framed, ensuring she could never accuse him without incriminating herself. By the end of that day, Turner had enough to open a formal investigation into Daniel Carter. The man Maplewood had once admired was no longer a grieving husband, but the prime suspect in a decade-long deception. And as the pieces came together, one truth became undeniable. Emily's suicide attempt hadn't been born from guilt. It had been her desperate escape from a marriage built on lies and a man who had destroyed her life twice over. Detective Turner's investigation into Daniel Carter intensified quickly after Emily's fragile confession. The financial records, the charity's missing funds, and the recently accessed dormant account all pointed in one direction. But Turner needed more than a trail of suspicion. He needed evidence that could hold in court. He revisited every piece of the case, looking for what tied Daniel's past deceit to Emily's present despair. What he found was a story that stretched beyond greed. It was about control, obsession, and the quiet cruelty of a man who had turned deception into a way of life. When Turner obtained Daniel's old employment files, he noticed something strange. The dates of his consultancy work at the charity overlapped with the first appearance of the missing funds. During that same period, Daniel had purchased new equipment for his firm, items well beyond what his modest income could have covered. Back then, the discrepancy had gone unnoticed because Daniel's role was temporary. The charity's bookkeeping was sloppy, and Emily Rhodes, as the donor coordinator, became the easiest person to blame. When the audit began, Daniel had erased his involvement, deleted his access logs, and quietly allowed suspicion to fall on Emily. She fled before anyone could uncover the truth, and Daniel had walked away untouched. But guilt has a strange way of resurfacing. Years later, Daniel's career had plateaued. His firm wasn't thriving, and his personal life was empty. Then, one night, he attended a charity gala where he saw her again, the woman who had unknowingly protected him from ruin. Emily had a different last name, a softer demeanor, and a cautious smile that carried no trace of recognition. For Daniel, it must have felt like fate handing him a second chance to rewrite the story. He charmed her slowly, carefully, weaving himself into her life with patience. Emily, believing she'd finally escaped her old mistakes, allowed herself to trust him. Within 2 years, they were married, and she left her old identity behind completely. What she didn't know was that Daniel never let go of the past. He kept records, photos, and even a backup of the old financial files that could destroy her if they resurfaced. It wasn't love that tied him to her, it was ownership. He wanted control over the one person who could expose him. Detective Turner began reconstructing that timeline with chilling clarity. He visited the Carter home once more, this time with a warrant to seize Daniel's devices. In a password-protected folder on Daniel's laptop, Turner found scans of old charity documents, including falsified emails suggesting that Emily had confessed to moving the funds. They were never submitted anywhere, but their existence made one thing clear. Daniel had been prepared to frame her again if needed. Turner also discovered that the dormant account accessed days before Emily's overdose had been logged into from Daniel's home office. The IP address matched perfectly. When confronted, Daniel didn't panic. He smiled thinly, the kind of smile Turner had come to expect from men who believed themselves untouchable. He denied everything, insisting that Emily had always been unstable and that her suicide attempt was proof of her guilt. But Turner had already heard enough to recognize the pattern. Daniel's calmness wasn't innocence, it was control. He spoke like a man still writing the story, still deciding what version of events the world would believe. Meanwhile, Emily's condition worsened emotionally. Though she had survived physically, she refused to return home. Doctors reported that she experienced panic attacks whenever Daniel's name was mentioned. Turner arranged for her to stay in protective care, away from her husband, while the investigation continued. In small moments of clarity, she began sharing pieces of memory that filled in the missing gaps. She recalled Daniel asking about her old job months before the letter arrived, pressing her to describe the investigation, even suggesting that she had been set up unfairly. He had planted the idea of her innocence in a way that seemed comforting, but it now felt like manipulation. Turner realized Daniel had been gauging how much she remembered, testing whether she suspected the truth. When Laura's letter arrived, everything must have fallen apart. Emily had likely confronted Daniel, and he must have convinced her that she was losing her mind, that her memories were wrong, that she was imagining connections that didn't exist. Isolation, fear, confusion, it was all part of his method. By the time Emily took those pills, she wasn't just tired of hiding her past. She was terrified of living in her present. Turner built the case piece by piece until it was airtight. The charity confirmed the falsified audit documents. Forensic analysts traced the deleted transactions to Daniel's login credentials. When the evidence was presented to the district attorney, an arrest warrant was issued. Police arrived at the Carter home just before dawn. Daniel, still in his robe, looked composed as ever, as though he had been expecting them. He didn't resist, didn't argue. As he was led away in handcuffs, he simply said, "She would have done the same." But that wasn't true. Emily had spent 10 years trying to escape her mistakes. Daniel had spent 10 years perfecting his. The difference between them was motive. Hers had been survival, his had been power. When Turner later visited Emily to tell her that Daniel was in custody, she sat silently for a long time before finally whispering, "He always said he saved me. I just never asked from what." The truth was now out, but it didn't feel like victory. Turner knew that some wounds don't close with justice. Emily's story wasn't just about a woman deceived. It was about how love can become the most dangerous disguise for manipulation. And though Daniel Carter was finally exposed, the damage he caused would linger long after the headlines faded. The arrest of Daniel Carter sent a shock through Maplewood. Neighbors who once admired him now avoided his name in conversation. The news spread quickly. The devoted husband who had appeared broken by his wife's suicide attempt was now accused of orchestrating years of deceit, theft, and psychological control. Reporters swarmed the quiet cul-de-sac, cameras flashing against the brick walls of the Carter home. Behind the spectacle, Detective Turner worked quietly, preparing the final pieces that would turn suspicion into undeniable truth. For days, Daniel maintained his composure. During interrogation, he answered every question with calm precision, denying any wrongdoing. He claimed the old bank account had been created by Emily, that she must have accessed it before her attempt. He painted himself as the victim of her instability, suggesting she had fabricated lies to ruin him after years of his devotion. To anyone else, his explanations might have sounded convincing, but Turner had already uncovered too much. Digital forensics confirmed Daniel's fingerprints on every key transaction and login. The charity's former staff identified his access credentials on the deleted records. Even the supposedly private journal entries that Emily had written, scanned copies found on Daniel's computer, proved that he had been reading her most personal thoughts without her. Knowing that Emily's recovery was slow, but as the investigation unfolded, she began to regain fragments of strength. She refused interviews, avoiding the growing media frenzy. In private therapy sessions, she revealed more about her life with Daniel, how he controlled their finances, how he subtly monitored her calls, how he convinced her that people from her past were watching her. He made her feel that the only safe place was beside him. In truth, he had been isolating her from anyone who might uncover his past. She had lived in the illusion of security, unaware that the man who comforted her nightmares was the same one who had created them. When Turner visited her one final time, she was sitting near the hospital window, sunlight catching her pale skin. She thanked him quietly for finding the truth, but said she didn't feel free. "He built me," she whispered. "Everything I became, every choice I made, came from what he allowed." Turner didn't respond. There were no words for the kind of captivity that leaves no bruises. The trial began 3 months later. The courtroom was packed. The prosecution presented a meticulous reconstruction of Daniel's decade-long deception, how he'd siphoned the charity funds, let Emily take the blame, and later sought her out to control the only person who could expose him. They revealed the falsified emails, the dormant account, and the manipulated journal copies. The evidence was airtight. Still, Daniel showed no emotion. He listened, expressionless, as if the story unfolding before him was someone else's. When he finally spoke, his defense centered on the same calculated narrative, that Emily had invented everything to cope with her guilt. He described himself as a patient man who loved too much. But the jury didn't believe him. After a short deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on charges of fraud, identity manipulation, and coercive control. Daniel Carter was sentenced to 15 years in prison. As he was led away, he turned once toward the gallery, searching for Emily. She wasn't there to eye in the months that followed. Maplewood returned to its quiet routine. The Carter home was sold, its garden overgrown and windows boarded up. For most residents, the story became a cautionary whisper, a reminder that perfection could hide darkness. But for Emily, the silence was something else entirely. She moved to a small coastal town under her real name, Emily Rhodes, and began working again, this time helping victims of psychological abuse. It was her way of reclaiming control, one fragile step at a time. One afternoon, while unpacking in her new home, she found an old wedding photo she had nearly thrown away. She turned it over and stared at Daniel's smiling face, realizing she no longer felt fear, just emptiness. On the back of the photograph, she wrote 4 words in steady ink. He knew. I didn't. Then she placed it in a box marked evidence and locked it away. Detective Turner closed the file on the Carter case soon after, but the story stayed with him. It wasn't the money or even the fraud that haunted him. It was how easily a life could be rewritten, how a lie told with confidence could become another person's reality. He'd seen murderers, thieves, and liars before. But Daniel Carter's crime had been quieter, a slow suffocation of trust that left no visible trace. In the final report, Turner wrote a line that summed up the entire case. Sometimes the most dangerous crimes are the ones committed in silence, behind smiles, by the people we think we know best. Emily's survival was proof that truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to surface. But it also served as a chilling reminder: love, in the wrong hands, can be the most powerful weapon of all.